lecture number 6. The image maker's imagination and the origins of art. Now, there's a continuous lineage of art that reaches back at least 30,000 years to those images that are left on cave walls in Europe and in Asia. Now, when I asked artists who are involved in my book project to look back at such images from, for example, the Chauvet Cave, they felt a kinship with those people, the people who produced those images. They appreciated the gestures that they undertook. They acknowledged the playful exploration and the use of familiar aesthetic devices. In other words, for my artists and other scholars who have done work and viewed these images, they have a distinctly modern quality. How do we address the origins of art, which is referred to as parietal art or rock art or cave art? And how do we build a bridge across 30,000 years to determine what art is as an experience? Let's begin with the cave. What did caves mean for people who lived during the Upper Paleolithic period? After all, spaces turn into meaningful places. What did these places mean to them? Was it just a refuge? Did it lead to the bowels of the earth because some of the images appear deeper and deeper that you can barely access these parts of the cave? Did they reach to other worlds? And we have to remember that the deeper you go, the less oxygen and the more removed you are in darkness. This can produce an altered state of consciousness. Now, these rock images. Imagine a person in a cave illuminated by the flickering light of a primitive oil lamp, which itself was first developed about 40,000 years ago. Animal fat in a wick placed in a shallow rock receptacle. So now we're in this cave and the light is flickering. As you scan the surface of the rock, familiar shapes can begin to emerge. Just like seeing the shape of a face or another figure in the moon, or as we lay back in the summer and look at the clouds as they move and change. These shapes are also moving because the light is moving. The light is flickering. The image is moving. The image is fluctuating. It's almost as if you're watching a movie. Now, what does this image mean? Is the rock surface solid? Does it provide access to another world? If we jump forward to our time and imagine a devoutly religious person sitting in a church looking at a religious image, are they looking at that image, or are they passing through the image into the spiritual world? How much has changed in 40,000 years? Now, for the cave people, these images were mostly of animals. What does this tell us about the early stages in art, what we call it art, and in society? In a certain sense, we have to look at the relationships between changing images and changing societies. I'm proposing that these image makers, these early image makers, note that I don't use the word artist. These image makers reflected an early expression of individuality and their own cutting-edge reflections on life. So let me talk about the emergence of an artist's role in culture. Now, it's one thing to imagine or to perceive an image moving on the undulating surface of a cave wall or a cloud, and quite another to engage that surface with a medium so as to preserve the image and share it with others. What would move someone to take a private image in their own mind that they perceive in the flickering light of a cave wall and preserve it on a surface. Now, it's very important. We have to be very careful not to generalize our modern values to people living in a different world 40,000 years ago. But we can consider this in relation to an emerging personal self. What do I mean? Well, look, the image on the wall, they didn't call it art. They would not have had a notion of art. The concept of art is very Western, or it can be Asian, but it's a very modern concept that we have. They weren't producing art in the sense that we conceive of a work that's found in a museum, chosen to decorate our lived spaces, or sold as a commodity. So how do we think about the person who engages in this act of preserving a private image that's projected onto the surface that's undulating in a cave? In other words, how do we build a bridge between an emerging image and the personal self or the social self? I'm arguing that the appearance of the image maker or artist role in society goes hand in hand with the emergence of the personal self, because more than one person, there was one person who did the art, but there were other people who did what we call the art. More than one person had the willpower to explore a technique for projecting and preserving images on the wall. We can relate this so-called cave art to two complementary processes that I've been discussing in my lectures: the notion of the thinking I, E-Y-E, and the being I, capital I, as complementary dynamics in art. He or she, the artist, so to speak, as a being I, makes a decision to project and preserve the image using thinking I techniques, both together in a complementary way. Let me talk about the thinking I first. The origin of art making can be related to stone tool usage, which barely changed over a period of 1,000,000 years. Stone tools are made through a process of knapping, whereby a harder stone is used to chip out and create an edge in a softer stone. In a sense, a negative space is created through this knapping gesture that leaves a positive surface that we call an edge. Chip it away, negative, it's empty, and what are you left with? The positive edge. Now, this can be both in 2 and 3 dimensions. When you see images of early tools, such as the one I'm showing you, you can see how the edge is created in a tool that's over 500,000 years old from the Sinai Desert. I argue that this working of negative and positive space and related symmetries, because you have the shape that's symmetrical in 2D, provides a cognitive paradigm, provides a schema that is transferred from tool production to image making. So for 1,000,000 years, they're making these stone tools with negative and positive spaces. Negative space, get rid of the stone. Positive space, the edge. What happens in art? By applying a darker material to the surface of a perceived image on the wall, you can create a negative background that recedes. And using a lighter quality material, the surface comes toward you. Positive and negative space in art. Positive, negative space in tool design. The image is completed with the lighter color. So darker moves away, lighter comes toward you. Creates the illusion of 3D depth. So the development of cave art, what we call cave art, can be viewed as an acceptation or extension and generalization of basic cognitive skills that became part of a sensory motor gesture In a sensory motor loop, we learn to manipulate a tool and related materials to produce particular visual effects. If I do this with the brush, I will create this effect. There's intention and purpose and technique, the thinking eye, E-Y-E. And we can match the results of our gestures with plans and expectations. We see it in the area of emotion, we see it here. So just as they created the tool with a mapping process to produce an edge in 2D or 3D, they can use a material to create a background of negative space and a foreground that comes toward us. It's taking a tool gesture into an aesthetic or artistic gesture. Now the being eye, capital I, the emerging self. In the motor sensory loop, we experience the effects of manipulating a medium that lends a coherent quality to the emerging image. So I take my animal cloth, material rather, and I take this chemical that I've created and I make a move and I feel playfully that gesture. I experience that gesture as an expressive gesture. I have made the gesture. I'm not just mapping it onto the purpose of the thinking eye. I'm creatively experiencing that act. We are guided by our unfolding experience as modern artists, or I'm arguing in this earliest stage of art. We learn to manipulate a medium to create an evocative image that preserves meaning and can shape the experiences of others. And there's an asymmetry because there are lights and darks. There are bigger shapes here and smaller shapes there, and we begin to move across the surface to unify our experience in a dynamic way. Now look, they're developing these techniques, but you can't have creation without appreciation. John Dewey reminded us of this, of doing and undergoing. There's no point in preserving an image on the surface of a cave wall if no one's looking at it. You may have an artist friend working with you, he, she looking at it. But there's something more to be said here. Because everyone is impressed by these cave images. And of course, when we see them in the wonderful books by Jean-Claude and others, the discoverer of the Chauvet Cave, we cannot be but moved or in awe to the extent that they produce a duplicate cave so we can go and have a recreated experience. Someone has to share the experience. Someone has to be moved by the work other than the person who first did it. There must be others in the cave who share the same kind of interests and actions. We call them artists. But what did they consider themselves? There's an existential moment here. Did they have a shamanic quality by producing images that could move others to go into a transcendental space, beyond the wall, into their religious meanings, however defined? In other words, these images were not produced for the artist, quote, alone. They're produced for the group as a whole, to be evocative for other members of the kinship group, who, for example, can be brought together before a hunt to see images of the animals that are so powerful and central to their survival. If audiences in the early 1900s were awed by the first moving pictures, imagine how powerful these rock images would be because of the flickering light to other clan members. So wait a second. We can build a bridge here between aesthetics and emotion. What's the relationship between art and empathy? Being moved. I argue that the process of being moved by art is an extension of being moved by other people in everyday life. Being moved being the operative construct. You can't have art without an audience that's moved. And the origins of being moved, I suggest, can be tied to the appearance of empathy in a society. It's a speculation. It is not truth. In order to have empathy in a social group, people have to exist as individuals whose life, events, and experiences can be observed in what's been called a landscape of emotion. We have to reach back into our own memories to bring to mind comparable events from our own lives that match those of others. Isn't that what empathy is about, as opposed to detached sympathy? You tell me about something that's happened to you, and I'm empathic to the extent that I reach into my life to find my experiences like yours, and I am moved. I'm suggesting that empathy appears with the development of language, increased symbolization, and abstract thought that enabled early peoples to experience others as individuals. What's the summary? The preservation and appreciation of images that we call art reflected the emergence of a group of people who, as individuals, produced enduring images through the manipulation of a medium in a way that is analogous to tool usage. They, the artists, that we call artists, were complemented by an audience, other artists or clan members who were moved by these images that may have been collectively viewed. The emergence of these images can be tied to the preservation of collective meanings, because once these images are on the wall, they're there for future generations. In a certain sense, it's a beginning of a visual history for other groups and clans that come after, or even visiting ones. Now, something changed 60,000 years ago in the human brain. I was shocked to discover and learn about this myself. How do these changes in the human brain relate to the emergence of art? Their implications relating changes in the brain and cultural developments. When we talk about social and cortical development, we move up a hierarchy from the reptilian through the mammalian to the primary brain centered in the neocortex, the primate brain being the quintessence. According to the social brain hypothesis, the size of the neocortex reflects information processing demands tied to increasing social networks. The society becomes larger, more people, bigger brain. But wait a second. We didn't end up looking like E.T., these cartoon notions of people, so to speak, from other parts of the universe. So I'm arguing that there are two kinds of integration going on in brain development. There's a vertical integration, where the primitive limbic system of the old animal brain becomes tied to the prefrontal cortex. Second, within the prefrontal cortex, there is development associated with prioritizing actions and abstractly reflecting on choices and meanings. So old brain, new brain, vertical hierarchy, up the down staircase of the mind-brain. And this is a double recursion. Why? Because we have two kinds of vertical development. The old brain reaches to the new brain, and within the new brain, we have higher levels that can reflect on our own actions. And all of this functions to help us survive. But there's a different kind of integration. There's a horizontal integration of the left and right hemispheres that's mediated by the prefrontal cortex. Now, the left hemisphere is more verbal and rule-bound, whereas the right hemisphere is more global and visual. Perhaps we can almost say the left hemisphere is more tied to a thinking eye, and the right hemisphere to a being eye of experience. Sensory motor in the left, motor sensory in the right. I propose that the emerging image makers relied on the integration of the left and right hemisphere through the ages to the prefrontal cortex in the new brain to guide creative production, while at the same time reaching down into the old brain where the primitive emotional-laden memories are of the challenges of the hunt and the survival. Vertical, old brain to new brain, horizontal, two parts of the hemispheres, the left that is planful, the right that is global, and the prefrontal cortex, specifically through Brodmann Area 10, becomes the framework for unification. This enables us to consolidate our images. Underlying this is the notion of culturally mediated neuroplasticity. As cultures evolve, as language evolves, it works hand in hand with cultural expressions that permit self-control on the one hand and expression on the other hand, bringing the left and right hemispheres together. Therefore, mind emerges through the interaction of people with environments in a challenging but language-based settings. The minds of our cave-dwelling ancestors were completely analog. They're in harmony with a challenging world of ice ages, of giant-sized animals that would frighten us beyond imagination. They're surviving in fauna and flora, and they're in these caves that are resonant with that life and preserving it. In the new digital age that we live in, we have all kinds of heuristics, we call them apps, that make it possible to cut across time and space in nanoseconds. So in the end, how does culture evolve? Some scholars talk about gradients. It gradually moves ahead with the addition of skills and knowledge. And others talk about stages, where we have radical changes leading from one stage to the next. One wonders, in some, whether the emergence of cave art reflected just this kind of combination of stage development where the two hemispheres come together through the prefrontal cortex that helps us organize, enabling us to externalize social meanings that are private for us, that lift society to a new level of insight and creativity. Thank you very much.